It was late November and winter had already begun in the mountains. I was a little late for the hiking season out there in the Cascades, but hey, I figured at least there would be less tourists to navigate around. I had taken a week off from work, eager to escape the monotony of my day job and spend some time in the great outdoors. Camping has always been my therapy. It was a perfect blend of tranquility and adventure. The less people, the better, in my opinion. I didn't mind the winter. I had enough cold weather gear to stay comfortable out there. I pitched my tent near a small glade, completely surrounded by Douglas firs that seemed to reach all the way up to the sky. After settling in, I decided to do some exploring. Away from the main trail, after a good hour's hike uphill, I stumbled upon this hidden wonder, an unassuming little cave carved right into the mountainside. The mouth of the cave was small, but it opened into a wider chamber that seemed to wrap itself around you like a cocoon. The walls were adorned with drawings, essentially hand marks and scratchings. I wondered if these were actual ancient cave paintings or possibly some modern graffiti. They looked authentic to me, but I wasn't an archaeologist or anything. I followed the drawings along the wall until I reached one depicting a figure that was disturbingly out of place. The figure was standing upright like a human, but had the body of an elk. It featured long, spindly limbs. The body was skeletal, as if it were emaciated. The ribs were clearly outlined beneath its skin. The head was where it got weird. It was just a skull with two antlers spanning across the cave wall. It had no eyes, just black holes in its skull. As unnerving as the drawing was, what caught my attention was the focus the artist had dedicated to it. It dominated the scene, dwarfing the other drawings. Was it some native spirit? Or perhaps a warning? I didn't have the slightest clue, nor did I have a way to figure it out. There seemed to be no connection to the other drawings along the wall. No story I could make out. I left the cave and headed back to camp, but the image of that creature was the only thing on my mind. Suddenly, the forest became eerily still. I figured it was my mind playing tricks on me. Seeing that drawing was sure to give me nightmares, I thought. I focused my energy on getting a fire going at camp and starting dinner, but I just couldn't shake off that eerie feeling. I felt a bit stupid, to be honest, like a kid that finds themselves hiding under the covers after reading an innocent ghost story. As the last embers of my fire died down, I settled down for the night and tried to get some shut-eye. But sleep was difficult to come by. I was ill at ease and couldn't get comfortable. Just as exhaustion was about to take me, I heard a sound pierce through the night. It was a deep wail, bouncing off the mountain faces and echoing all around me. I froze in my tent, hoping it was a single occurrence and whatever creature made those sounds was moving on. But unfortunately for me, that wasn't the case. The wails echoed again, but closer this time. Whatever lurked in the darkness was nearby. Now, many would expect the rational part of me to hunker down and stay put until dawn. But fight or flight kicked in. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate the source of the sound. Flashlight in hand, I cautiously stepped into the darkness. Every sound in the woods amplified my awareness tenfold. I felt raw and exposed, like I was being watched, but I couldn't tell from where. The smell of decay suddenly filled the air, a putrid, suffocating stench that was none other than a rotting corpse. I had come across enough critters dead along the road to know what death smelled like, and this was it. I trekked on, the beam from my flashlight doing little to cut through the oppressive darkness. As I neared the origin of the sound, I saw something that will be etched in my memory forever. It was the creature from the drawing, but it was standing before me, alive in the flesh. The creature had hair on it like a deer, but it was all peeled away to reveal a bare, bone-white skull. Loose, dried skin hung around its neck, that I can only assume was once part of its face. There seemed to be a glow of some sort coming from its empty eye sockets, like there was something burning within its skull. Before I had a chance to react, the atrocious figure vanished into the wilderness, and I was left alone with my heart lodged in my throat. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. I stayed awake waiting for the beast to return, but it never did. As soon as daybreak reached my camp, I loaded up and hiked right back out of there. As I retraced my steps back to safety, each footfall felt like I was putting more of that horrid night behind me. Was the creature I saw that night a Wendigo? Or was it a fabrication of my mind fueled by those cave drawings? Sleep deprivation might have played a substantial role, and to be honest, I hope that is what it was. That would mean that thing isn't real. The thought of it out there right now wandering around the dark places of the earth is enough to make me sick. Whatever the truth might be, if you like to spend your time alone in the wilderness, tread with caution. You never know what watches from the shadows. It was the winter of 2017, and I had decided to embark on a bit of a solo adventure. I'd set my sights on Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada, a vast expanse of pristine wilderness, cloaked in snow this time of year. There's just something about camping out in the isolation of nowhere that makes me feel alive, you know? If you've never been, Algonquin in the winter is a picturesque array of snow-capped trees and frozen lakes. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited. So there I was, trekking through ankle-deep snow. The cold was seeping in through every layer of clothing I had on. It wasn't long before I arrived at my chosen campsite. It was in a small clearing but still far enough away from the trails. Not that many people were on them this time of year. Setting up camp wasn't as difficult as I'd thought it would be. With the frozen ground, the pegs took a bit of persuasion, but I eventually got the tent upright. Even in bad weather, I always enjoyed setting up camp. It's one of those things where you can see your progress right there in front of you. I got a fire started and made sure I had everything else in order before the evening settled in. I had brought some canned stew with me, so dinner was a quick affair. Cans are heavy to carry, but nothing beats warm stew in weather like this. With the fire waning and the stars coming out above me, I retired to my tent for the night. I was excited for my adventures to come, but I knew I had to get some sleep first. All was calm and peaceful. There was an occasional rustle of the wind echoing through the forest, but other than that, just silence. As I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable on the hard, cold ground, I heard a strange noise. It wasn't the natural sounds you'd expect, like the cracking of branches or the howl of a distant wolf. This was something else. It sounded like a soft whisper, a faint clicking noise in the dark. It was unusually rhythmic. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or maybe a small animal. But as the minutes passed, the sound seemed to grow louder and closer. I had hoped maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me, but I think, even then, I knew better. There was something out there, even if I wanted to deny it. The sound grew louder and louder until I finally got up to check it out. Wrapping up in my warmest gear and gripping my flashlight, I slowly unzipped the tent. The cold wind immediately hit my face, like a chilly slap. The white glow from my flashlight scanned the trees surrounding my camp. Their shadows made for eerie figures on the snow-covered ground. All I could think about was that strange clicking sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere close by. I kept having this sensation that the noise wasn't coming from one specific direction, but seemed as though it was closing in from all around. That's when I saw an odd movement in the distance. It took my eyes a minute to focus in on the creature. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was this ghastly, pale creature crawling through the snow. It had the form of a human, but it ran like a dog. And yet, despite its awkward body, it maneuvered through the snow with a strange swiftness, like it was floating on air. The speed at which it moved was entirely unnatural. Now, I've seen many creatures in my time. Wolves, moose, and even bears. But this was different. It wasn't something belonging to nature. The face was the worst part. It had these large black eyes, inhumanly vast and void-like, that took up entirely too much of its face. It had no discernible nose, just an endless expanse of white skin, all the way up until its gaping mouth. Remember that clicking sound I mentioned? Well, it was coming from the creature. The thing was straight out of a nightmare that I wish I could unsee. I wondered where it came from and if there were more of them out there. As I stood frozen in fear, the creature halted, craning its head slowly to look at me. Time didn't just slow, it nearly stopped. The creature locked eyes with me, and I felt like I was just staring into two black pits. There was no soul behind those eyes. No humanity. There was just nothing. It was that moment of eerie connection where a predator chooses its prey. I'd like to say I did something heroic, but in reality, I did what any sane person would do. I bolted, took off back into the safety of my tent, and packed up my things as quickly as my hands would move. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever that creature was, but damn did I try. Looking back, I often wonder if there was more to what happened that night. Was the creature simply curious, or was it something more sinister? Whatever the creature wanted, it didn't chase me out of the forest that night. If it had, I certainly wouldn't be here to tell you my tale. I was told later that my encounter sounded much like the creature known as the crawler. It is unknown what their true intentions are, but they seem to try to lure people into the woods. I've stopped doing solo trips since my encounter with it. I still like to spend my free time in the forest when I can, but I'm a lot more careful now, and I make sure to watch my surroundings. And you can bet that if I ever hear clicking in the woods, well, I'm not going to stick around and wait for that creature to find me again. And I suggest you don't either. You'd think life in the Australian outback would be straightforward. After all, there's not much out here except for red kangaroos and endless stretches of arid land. And yet, here in our tiny town, things have been getting mighty strange. For the past few weeks, we've had a string of disappearances. Not the kind of thing you expect around here. They've all happened around the same area, a secluded watering hole at the edge of town. It was used by wildlife and locals alike to cool off from the hot summer sun. Now, I'm not the town sheriff or anything. Hell, the nearest station is miles away. But I've been here longer than most. When you've lived in a place for 35 years, you kind of feel a responsibility to step up when things go south. And things were heading south. Me and a couple of the lads took it upon ourselves to do some poking around. We canvassed the area, spoke to the folks who'd last seen the missing, and asked all the usual questions. Of course, there were other investigations going on, but they weren't getting any answers. Our next stop was the watering hole. I've known this patch of water for as long as I can remember. I've seen it flood, dry up, and once back in '86. I even fished a roo out of it, but I'd never seen it dark like this. The sun was beating down hard that day, near enough to fry an egg on the ground, but when I stood at the water's edge, I could feel a chill. The birds were quiet, which was a damn oddity on its own. Some of the lads thought it was because one of the neighbors, Rogers we always called him, had a habit of shooting at anything that moved. He said it kept his eyes sharp, but he wasn't outside. We could see his house from the water's edge, and there wasn't any movement down there. There was a faint odor in the air that reminded me of the time I found a dead snake under my outdoor freezer. It was a sickly, rotting stench that clung to the back of my throat. It was so bad you could taste it. But the weirdest of all was the water itself. It was strangely stagnant, barely a ripple breaking its glass-like surface. Now, if you've ever been near a water source in the Australian summer, you'd know it practically buzzes with life. Frogs, insects, birds, even crocs too if you're in the right place. But this place was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Whilst the lads were joking around, my eyes were drawn to the frothing bubbles that started popping up from the pool. My mind was racing, and then something starts to emerge. We all stood there frozen in place as we watched it. A massive being started to rise out of the water. And I mean, this beast was truly massive, easily more than 6 feet tall. It was surreal, like something out of those cheap monster flicks I watched as a kid. The beast was covered in scales, sharp and jagged. They were all over its body, making it obvious that whatever was standing before us was cold-blooded, even though none of us knew what exactly it was. I know this is going to sound crazy, but it was like the mix of a human and a dinosaur. The form was eerily similar to a human. The beast could stand up on 2 legs and appeared to have the ability to walk that way, though it stayed in the water. It had hulking arms tipped with black claws and legs that had a similar anatomy to that of a man. But the worst part of it was its face. The creature's head was distinctly reptilian. The eyes were yellow and slitted like a snake's. Whatever human characteristics I saw in the creature's body, I didn't see in the face. There seemed to be an intelligence behind its eyes, but there was no humanity there. I don't know how long we stood there staring at it. Maybe we were afraid to move, or maybe we were all just in shock. It broke the silence when it hissed. It was a sound so cold and alien that it froze my blood in my veins. Despite the horrifying call, it didn't come out of the water towards us. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, it turned around and slid back into the water, disappearing without a trace. I stood there a while longer, stuck in a sort of stunned disbelief. It took one of the lads clapping his hand on my shoulder to jolt me back to reality. But I didn't say a word about what had happened to them. Not a single word. Instead, I let them carry on joking, even joining in myself. In the days following, I battled with whether or not to share my encounter. People around here are easily spooked. An outlandish story about a dinosaur creature lurking in our watering hole. It could cause a real panic. Or worse, I could end up in a room with rubber walls. I was afraid no one would believe me, but I didn't want to let it go. What if someone else went missing, and it was because they took a swim in that pool, and I didn't say anything? Still, no one was going to believe me about this reptilian creature, so this is what I did. I went out and made the most official-looking signpost I could, and wrote up a blurb about the water testing positive for E. coli. I knew nobody would swim in that, and I went out one night when no one was around, and I hammered the sign into the ground. I was terrified the creature would show itself again, but it didn't. Maybe it wasn't the greatest solution, but we haven't had any disappearances since. So the next time you see signs telling you not to swim in the water, just know that it might not be for the reasons you think. Be careful out there. This happened a few years back when I took up a full-time job as a park ranger in Wharton State Forest, New Jersey. I had been doing conservation work behind a desk in a lab, but this was my first real job out in the field. And oh boy, what a job it was. I could have never prepared myself for what I saw out there that day. But then again, it's not exactly something that gets covered in our job training either. I remember this one instance like it was yesterday. I'd been on the job about a month. Because of the area, there was an ongoing joke around the park office about the creature they called the Jersey Devil. Every time somebody in the park had a complaint or filed an incident report, the seasoned rangers would joke and blame it on the creature. I had assumed they were just having some fun at the new guy's expense, but I have to admit there's something about the quiet darkness in that place, and the crackling evening air that gets to a man. Makes you think the things that go bump in the night might not just be stories after all. That night was like any other. I parked at the main office and clocked in for my shift. My duties on the night shift were simple: patrol the park, make sure everyone's safe, and nothing's out of the ordinary. Helps to have a good flashlight and a reliable truck. As I started my rounds, the only sounds in the forest were the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional hoot of an owl from somewhere in the trees. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a glow that was almost enough to see by without my light. It was peaceful, almost calming, until I noticed something odd. Out of pure habit, I shined my light at the trees from the safety of my truck. I didn't see anything at first, but then my flashlight beam picked up footprints. They were oddly shaped and not something I recognized offhand. I was pretty familiar with the wildlife in the area and what their tracks looked like, and these were just odd. They were different, alien almost. The creature that made them definitely had claws of some sort. They almost looked like dinosaur tracks in a way. I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to think. There's a certain feeling, you know, when you're out there surrounded by a dark, dense forest at night. Anything could be out there in the shadows and you wouldn't know it. It sure gets the adrenaline going. I can tell you that much. I let the truck's engine idle as I hopped out to get a closer look at the footprints. Not much in the forest frightens me, but this had me spooked. As soon as I stepped onto the ground, I wanted to go straight back to the truck, but my fear felt foolish and unfounded. I was the only one out there. No one would have known if I turned back, but I felt like I needed to go on. So, I turned my flashlight into the direction of those tracks and headed to investigate. I expected the tracks to belong to a bear. They had probably been smeared around in the mud, and there would be a logical explanation there to greet me. But that isn't what I found. The prints were clear imprints, no mistaking them. They looked like a cross between a hoof and a giant bird track. That is the only way I can explain it. And whatever made them, judging by the length of stride, was enormous. I was so fixated on the tracks that I didn't notice the traces of sulfur in the air. It was a sort of rotten egg kind of smell that was beyond strange for the forest setting I was in. As I delved deeper into the woods, the smell grew stronger, and my flashlight began shuddering in my grip. I should have just turned around, and that's just what I was thinking about doing, when my light beam hit something up ahead. There it was, standing still and tall in the middle of the footpath, shrouded half in shadow, half in the sickly yellow glow of the moon. It was a creature straight out of my worst nightmares. I knew immediately that I was looking at the infamous devil. It had these long, bony limbs that were encased in scales. They were sort of iridescent in the moonlight. From its back sprouted these bat-like wings. The wingspan on them was impressive, to say the least. The creature was huge. Its head was the most terrifying part, though, like a nightmarish blend of a horse and a goblin. It had these glowing red eyes that seemed to bore straight into my soul. I felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up, and a primal fear gripped me as I stood there helplessly staring at the creature in front of me. I think I was in shock. When I came to my senses a moment later, I did the only thing my panicked mind could think of. I bolted back toward the truck, praying to God knows who that I wasn't going to be dinner for this beast. Somehow I reached the truck and finally the ranger station. I locked myself in for the rest of the night, refusing to go outside until the sun was up. I questioned everything. I could hardly believe what I'd seen. It took me a good while to get a grip on myself and to convince myself to get back on the park patrol. But honestly, how do you go back to normal after something like that? I haven't seen the creature since, but I don't get out of my truck much after dark these days either. I've just sort of accepted it's out there and I avoid it at all costs. It seems happy with that arrangement, and I try not to think about it too much. But that's my story. After hearing some other folks share their stories on here, I thought it might be time to add mine to the pile. This is from about 5 years back, and it's a night I'll never forget. I remember it being a dark, moonlit night in the Highlands of Scotland. I was nearly right beside Loch Ness. I know what you're thinking, this is going to be a tall tale about the infamous Loch Ness monster, but you'd be wrong. There is something else out there on the moors. I was in Scotland for a work conference. Now, I don't know how much you know about Loch Ness, but it's surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery you could imagine. I was staying in the closest thing to a hotel you could find in the village nearby. I got used to waking up each day to this serene body of water out of my bedroom window. I was pretty skeptical of the local folklore. I didn't believe in sea monsters, so I ignored the other tales as well. I can tell you no, I shouldn't have. I had a long day at work and ended up taking a late-night stroll along the loch to clear my mind. I can't say it turned out quite the way I planned. The path was familiar from my daily walks. It turned rocky and uneven as it followed the edge of the loch, but I knew it well enough by then to press on. I enjoyed the solitude, just me and my thoughts. At one point, I remember stopping to just take it all in, looking out over the water. The moonlight danced around on the surface of the water. The woods around me darkened as I went further. It wasn't any darker outside, but the trees seemed to take away the natural light of the moon. The sounds of my footsteps echoed with an odd loneliness as I trekked on. It was silent, almost too silent. For a moment, I felt this brief, inexplicable fear. I laughed at my own sentimentality and tugged my coat closed against a sudden chill on the air. I thought the feeling had passed, but out of nowhere, I had this strange sensation like I was being watched. It was like there was something in the dark waiting, observing me. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on the eeriness of the place, and continued, albeit a bit faster. A sudden rustle in the trees near the path made me pause. Wild animals weren't uncommon in these parts, but this sound was a little too close for comfort. I glanced around, squinting in the dark. That's when I caught the shadow of something larger moving among the trees. For a moment, I thought it was another person. The outline seemed to suggest it, but then it shifted and became something entirely odd. I struggled to figure out what it was. I couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread starting to wrap around me. I remember wondering whether I should run, or if my eyes were just playing tricks on me. The rustling of leaves grew momentarily louder, only to be replaced by an eerie silence. And then, through the darkness shone two large, reflective red eyes. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes. I still didn't know what I was looking at, but those eyes, it was like they froze me in place and I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't run even if I wanted to. It moved out of the shadows, approaching me directly. I was almost certain I was going to be killed by this thing, but I couldn't bring myself to run. It was like I was paralyzed. What I saw when that thing came out of the woods is something that will stay with me forever. At first, it was a dark silhouette, almost human in form, but not quite. It was covered in something black that seemed to sway in the wind. Long hair or feathers, perhaps. It had two massive wings coming from behind its shoulders. But those eyes were the worst part. They were completely out of this world, utterly alien. The panic within me escalated quickly. I screamed at my body to move, to run, but I couldn't. The only thing I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears. It looked me over once and then simply turned around and it was gone. Just up and vanished into the night, leaving me standing there on the edge of the lock with my terror. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a couple of minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Once the creature was gone, I finally managed to convince myself to move again. The eeriness remained in the woods as I made the longest trek back to my lodgings in town. I had trouble processing what had happened, what I'd seen. I was hoping that it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the shadows. That thing couldn't have been real, could it? But then I heard other stories of the creature with the red eyes. It was called the Mothman. I don't know what it wanted or why it approached me that night. Or, for that matter, why it let me go. I don't think I'll ever have answers, but I figured I'd share my story anyway, in case there's someone else out there that has seen it and is trying to convince themselves they didn't. It wasn't a bad dream or a trick of the night. It was real, even if you don't want to believe it.